Welcome to CTO Insights, where we unpack the strategies behind high-performing engineering teams. I'm your host, Katerina, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Mojtaba Hosseini, VP of Engineering at Zapier. In this episode, we unpack how Zapier built a strong culture of customer focus, continuous measurement, and long-term performance. We talk about their 4-year journey of refining engineering metrics, making them useful and team-driven instead of top-down. We also dig into Zapier's approach to AI, how they're measuring its real impact, and how engineering can help other teams adopt AI in meaningful ways. Stay tuned, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights into creating high-performing teams that stand out products. This episode is brought to you by Adima, a global network of top developers connecting businesses with world-class talent. Whether you need to scale your team and bring an idea to life, Adima empowers you to increase your engineering capacity without the overhead of traditional hiring. Visit adima.it to learn more. Mojtaba, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a quick introduction. Tell us a bit about your role at Zapier, what you're focused on right now as VP of Engineering.
Yeah, I'm VP of Engineering at Zapier. I've been at Zapier for about 4 years now, and we've been through quite a bit of a journey, of course, with the latest advances in AI, but even before that, trying to build a high performing team. Whether again before AI, after AI, who knows what comes next, and that's really been my focus.
Amazing. Going a bit deeper into the team structure, what you do differently at Zapier. Can you tell us more about that, and what are the core strengths of your team, the core things that make your team high performing?
Yeah, we've been kind of talking about engineering as essentially applied science in the service of customers. So there are sort of 3 key pillars in the way we look at engineering. The first is that it is science. And so there's a lot of learning, which then, comes into having both qualitative and quantitative metrics. Then there's not just learning for learning its sake, for its own sake, but it's learning applied to solve a problem. And so there's that aspect of not just learning, but then having a feedback loop of applying that learning and seeing what impact you have. And then the third part is, well, why are we doing all this? What's in the service of customers? At the end of all of this, a high-performing organization that's learning and experimenting, et cetera, the ultimate outcome is that the customer is benefiting. So that's sort of like, that's how we think about these 3 pillars: learning, applying it towards a particular problem, but that problem needs to bring a solution for our customers.
I love that customer focus part. And a while ago, when I first learned about, Zapier's engineering culture, your hiring process and everything, I was fascinated to see that in all of the job descriptions for engineers, customer support was part of the responsibilities. And I know that it doesn't scale. You mentioned that you had to, work with it, adjust it as a company scale. But that customer focus and, it's in the DNA of everyone that works at Zapier. They are focused a lot on solving the customer problems, understanding their needs. Can we dive deeper into the feedback loop, the communication with customers, how maybe the data you get from support to feed into the engineering process?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, going back when Zapier was a lot smaller, it wasn't just engineering. Actually, the entire company, no matter where you worked, every week you had to spend a couple of hours on support rotation. So this is when Zapier was a little bit more of a startup, people having a lot of hats and so on. As we scaled, we found that it just didn't work as well. It wasn't as efficient. Somebody working in legal and so on, it was difficult for them to do that. Even engineering, the product grew so much, and they have so many different products now that it was difficult to accommodate that. And so we've had to scale, our operation the same way we've scaled the company. So we have a few things that are fairly standard. As an example, we've got support ride-alongs where engineering folks sign up and they can follow along at the same time as support and really kind of see both the customer issues and pain points, but sometimes more importantly, how support is trying to debug an issue. And so they kind of go back with that empathy of, I'm not just building this feature, I need to make it so that it's easy to troubleshoot for the support team. So that kind of brings that. So support ride-alongs are one. We did them both because we're a full remote company. We did them both remotely, but also this is actually a very successful and much wanted session during our in-person summit. And so support, because during our summit, you still need to have support for our customers. We actually have them in a particular room, a conference room, and engineers sign up and go and sit beside support folks so that they can see how that goes. So again, both in person and remote, we do that. Another one, a little bit more structured to that, is voice of customer. So we go through, aggregate both the data from customer, but also anecdotes. People leave us a lot of comments, positive and constructive, about our product, and we aggregate those and bring that every month to specific teams. Like, okay, this is the feedback from the customers that translates into the roadmap. And other things like support top 10. These are like the top 10 issues we're seeing, and so on and so forth. Some teams also do a really good job, especially if they've got a feature that's going to alpha and beta. Once they get that into alpha, they've got a full story sort of watch party where they kind of watch customers use the product and they go, oh, okay, we kind of see that flow isn't exactly what we wanted. Let's go back, let's iterate. Another way, again, this is fairly standard, is dogfooding. Like, we use Zapier internally very, very much. A lot of engineers have automated a lot of their workflows. If there's a long Slack thread about a design decision, they kind of have, they kick off a workflow or, summarizes it, puts in a document. So by using the product themselves extensively, engineers typically get that empathy for the customers because they're using it as well. I'll end with one thing, which is, again, when it comes to scale, as we've expanded up market, again, we've had to change and learn, because being traditionally self-serve, if you're only listening to your existing customers, you're not going to hear as much about your potential customers, right? So it's a little bit of the survivorship bias in a sense. And so we've had to even change with that and say, okay, all those mechanisms are great, but those are our existing customers. How do we hear from our potential customers, prospects? So we've had to now connect engineering with sales and solution engineering. So we've got an engineering response team where they work directly with sales and solution on prospective customers in order to see what things they ask for the pilot, what sort of things they run into. And that's a very different type of, you could say, customer empathy and customer feedback than the folks that have already sort of gotten onto Zapier.
I love it. And I was going to ask how much of the roadmap is actually product team planning based on, the predictions and expectations and your vision of the product, and how much of it is focused on the customer feedback.
It varies a lot based on, you could say, where the product or the feature is in its maturity. So we have some products that are very, very early. They're still in beta. For those, we actually have Slack channels with early access programs. So engineers are actually in the same Slack channel as the customers, because these are, again, new features, brand new. And so the feedback loop there can even sometimes be in the same day. Early access program, customer says, oh, this is not working. The engineer doesn't need to go, well, let me talk to the product manager and put that on the, no. It's like, we got to get this fixed. This is in the early access. For the more mature products that have been around over a decade and so on, maybe there's a lot more upkeep and maintenance and keep the lights on and so on. Then it's a little bit more of a balance between sort of a longer term roadmap and maybe support tickets, critical escalations from support, bugs and so on, and then kind of keep the lights on. So it really, really depends where the product is and the team is in its maturity.
That's great. I want to dive into metrics, but first we are talking about high performance and, metrics that are in the service of team performance. What does that mean to you? What does high performance mean, and focusing on it, especially building it for the long term?
Exactly. So for high performance, we ground that in those three pillars again. So high performing team has, again, the applied science in service of customer. So high performing team, truly the outcome is customers are happy. So that's got to be there. The customer focus has to be there. Now we're looking at the other two, which are, the applied and the science part. So when it comes to both kind of metrics and learning, this is where we look at the applied science and say, engineering is inherently about learning and applying those learnings. And if you look at the scientific method, it comes from, you have a hypothesis of how things should work or will work. You measure something, you have a baseline, then either you see how it changes or you introduce a change, and then you measure it, and then you see, well, did that actually do what I thought it would do? So measurement and metrics, just as a tool of learning, becomes central to a high-performing engineering organization. So when I look at when I think of high performing, the way I look at it is, it's not so much a bar that a team needs to hit. It's the slope at which it is learning, because that bar is constantly moving up. The bar of high performance this year is different than it was 5 years ago. And that's mostly from what customers want. What it was magical 5 years ago for a customer is now table stakes. Now customers say, of course, I need to get XYZ. And a year from now, 6 months from now, again, the bar of high performance and what the customers need are going to be higher. And so that's the way I look at it. It's like, it's that slope of learning needs to be very, very steep in order to get to that. And a part of that is, again, measuring things, learning and applying it.
You introduced engineering metrics at Zapier around 4 years ago when it was not as popular as today. Frameworks like DevX and other productivity frameworks weren't a trend. What prompted the decision back then, and what were some signals that you were looking for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not quite sure what got me going at this. Has always been a little bit of a passion of mine. I've always been a little bit surprised that engineering has maybe traditionally been reticent to use metrics on its own in a way. Whereas again, I kind of look at it as if our engineering degrees have on them applied science, how can we possibly not have measurement? Now, again, we have to be careful about measurement and so on. So this has always been there. Maybe at a certain time when not just Zapier, but the market was like growing very rapidly and growth was a little bit easier, organizations did not need to have as much due diligence and understanding of what levers, what input metrics drive the output metrics, if that makes sense. Things were going well. There's a lot of growth in the market, et cetera. This is the 2020, 2021, 2022 sort of era. Maybe at that time there wasn't much of a need, but for me, I just knew that even that growth, we need to know what is driving that growth. Is it things that we are doing? Are we getting better? Is that why there are more customers? Or is that almost like, the market itself going up and, with the rising tide, all boats are being lifted? And if that's the case, that's great for everybody. But at some point, we will need to learn and know which ones are our leading indicators, our lagging indicators, and so on. So it was kind of like an intrinsic need, I thought, that we had to understand the engineering as an organization. And so we started on that journey about 4 years ago.
And how did you start with it? What were the first thing that you started measuring? What were some mistakes that you did maybe on the way?
Lots of mistakes and learnings. Honestly, this has been quite a journey for us. In some respect, approaching this as just any change management is probably the way to go. Folks need to understand the why, and then you kind of go through the what and the how and so on. We did that, but maybe more interesting is talking about some of the objections, some of the issues, maybe some of the mistakes that we made initially, which is again part of the learning. But some of our initial metrics that we were measuring were not very good. And so when you have almost no metrics, it's very difficult for your first iteration to be a good metric because you don't even know what you should be measuring. And so you could say it was a mistake, but at the same time, it was for us to get started. They say start. We said, okay, we have nothing. We should have something. And at that time, we really had, in the industry, we had the DORA metrics. So we started with those and said, okay, these are good, but let's also add in our own. And we had I would consider fairly basic and in some ways crude metric, which is as a team, per month you commit to something. Are you predictably hitting your commitment or not? Very, very simple, all sorts of problems with that metric. But this was our way to just start. And that was kind of the message that we had was, it doesn't mean that we will stay with this metric. We will move past some of these metrics. We need to get going on measuring, get into the habit of understanding how to measure, how to evaluate, and some of these metrics will go away because they're not useful. And so I think one of the things that I would do over, if I was to go back in time, was to very clearly kind of articulate that probably our first few metrics are going to be bad metrics. They're not going to be helpful. And that's okay. We're not going to get it right. The idea is to start measuring. We'll learn and we'll adapt. Whereas in a way, we made some errors initially trying to find the metric or the metrics. And we learned after a while that there is no such thing and you need to sort of like adjust. That was one. Another, I would common mistake that I've seen others make, and we fell for it, was trying to have the same metric for all teams as the first step. Eventually, we did learn that there are some metrics that are helpful. As an example, just measuring, engineering capitalization. This is something accounting needs. We need to have it anyway. All teams need to do it to know the percentage of capacity that goes to sustaining versus new value. But other than a few of those, sometimes it's better to say, okay, if the teams should probably have metrics that are more appropriate to their context. Let's say for a greenfield, very quick moving, a new product that's in early product market fit, they have different metrics. Maybe for them, velocity metrics are very important. They wouldn't have a lot of tech debt. They wouldn't have a lot of sustaining. Another team that's been developing products for over a decade, well, their velocity metric is one thing, but really their upkeep, their keep the lights on work, their incident load, their SLOs and SLI, that's where you need to sort of like, and so another, I would say, common mistake can be, especially when it's a top-down metric demand for an executive to sort of ask for, I need one metric or two, three metrics that all teams measure. The problem with that is that metric may not be helpful for many teams. And so you want to get to a point where teams themselves are finding the best metrics for them and learning based on that. So that's another one. You got lots of mistakes. I can talk about all the mistakes we made as well. Some of the success.
That's great. I love it that what you say about the teams finding the metrics themselves. I think there is a lot of resistance towards metrics because they come from the top down, and a lot of times are focused mainly on the input, which doesn't really paint the whole picture. What are some good metrics that maybe survive the test of time, or you are currently using, or you would advise teams to start with if they are starting on their journey right now?
Yeah, the way we approached it was we broke down our metrics into 5 categories. And then we asked the teams to look at which of these categories are most pertinent and important to them and start measuring for that. So the 5 categories, the first one is really product metrics. It's not engineering's product metric in terms of engagement, adoption from customers, and so on. These are pretty standard. Most teams have that. Sometimes platform teams don't have it. So for them, they need to start measuring the impact of the platform on their customers, et cetera, NPS, et cetera. The second category is around workload in terms of, you could talk about it as more like input metrics. What percentage of capacity is planned work? What percentage is unplanned work? What percentage is just sustaining existing products? And how much, what percentage is going to creating new either products or features? These are sort of like what we call workload metrics or input metrics. Then the third category was around, again, maybe like more productivity metrics, cycle time, lead time, story point velocity, et cetera, et cetera. And in this, we also add some quality ones as well in terms of like incidents and, time to recover, time to detect, et cetera. And then the fourth category is around really the service level metrics. So this isn't as much about the team, but the health of the services that they own, right? These are like, SLIs, uptime, et cetera, et cetera. And the fifth one is team engagement. Are folks engaged with their work? Do they understand the work? Are they aligned with the strategy? Is the workload for them? Does it feel sustainable, et cetera, et cetera? So we kind of looked at it at 5, and then each team, depending on what problem it had or what problem it wanted to solve, started to focus on one of these. So if a team, as an example, was heavily burdened by keep the lights on work and tech that was really, really weighing them down and they couldn't get to new features, for them, they started measuring, workload metrics and showing their product manager, look, I'm spending 70% of my capacity just on keep the lights on. The number of services we have, this is too much. And then that precipitated the conversation of, okay, but if we want to have more features, can we invest to pay back some tech debt so that 70% sort of keep the lights on toil can be reduced? So for those teams, workload became sort of like the key metric. For other ones, it was, look, velocity is good, things are good, but the team doesn't feel they understand where this is going. So their engagement score is not that high. This is not good. That means they're churning out features. Things are good from that point of view, but they can't connect the dot of where this is going. And so that precipitated a different conversation with, let's say, with product, with design and leadership in terms of, you need to give us a longer term vision and strategy so that the team can engage. But coming back to your question of which have become standard across all teams, I mentioned one already. This one really, we do it for accounting purposes, but this is standard across all teams. We have to do it, but it's also useful. And that is the percentage of sustaining work versus new work. Accounting needs it, but it's also a good engineering one that we look at. And then I would say some of the engagement ones are also kind of common between all the teams. Every 6 months, we do a big engagement survey, and then some teams have a more frequent one. I would say those are standard. The product metrics are also fairly standard, but when it comes to velocity and quality, we don't have that much standardization, maybe outside of incidents. For incidents, we do look at that in terms of, like, again, time to detect, time to respond. And again, some of the learning quality of retros is another one we're trying to measure with the use of AI and so on. So those have been standard. They survive the test of time, and teams themselves find it useful to keep them as they're sort of evergreen metrics. Some of the other ones, they stop paying attention to one because it's not useful, or they've achieved their goal, they move on to another one.
Yeah, back to the comment that you made about most of the initial metrics not being good enough and needing to adjust or remove. What was the process that you followed for that? Like, how did you evaluate whether a metric was actually supporting the performance of the team?
Yeah, really good question. Again, this is one of those where in retrospect, I'm trying to think whether there was a better way of doing it, but I can tell you what we did, and it has pros and cons. What we did was top down. It wasn't organic, sort of bottom up. Okay, these are the metrics we need. There was just there seemed to be no appetite and no skill in terms of choosing the right metric. So we started very top down. We said every team has to do X, Y, Z, and then every month the executive is going to look at these metrics. And so initially it was, I would say, extremely top down. It was me looking at these metrics, asking the questions. After a few iterations, we got to a point where we were asking the directors to ask those questions because they had seen me ask it, right? So, maybe the first iterations, they kind of see me ask, oh, this metric went up. What does that mean? Does it mean anything to you? Do you know the answer? And if they said no, I'd say, okay, maybe next iteration you can do that. Or after some time, they would see, the metric goes up and down, it has no meaning. We would say, is this a good metric? Can you replace it with one that actually tells you anything? Slowly, it became so that in our monthly operational reviews, so every team basically has this monthly operational review cycle. Instead of the executive asking that question, the directors started to ask those questions. And the executives were taking a backseat, maybe just looking, giving some feedback. After some time, and again, when I talk about time, these are now months and quarters that are passing, we got to the point where engineering managers themselves started to ask the team that question. So they would do a retro and say, oh, we had a sprint, and it looked like our cycle time has really reduced. That's fantastic, but why? And if, they would say, well, you know what, this sprint, we did a lot of these paper cuts, tiny little bugs. Of course, our cycle time was small. And they go, oh, okay, that's interesting, right? The ultimate thing, and this is only now some of our teams, engineering managers and product managers started to ask these questions of each other. So it's not even the directors are asking this or the team, they're asking each other these types of questions in terms of, hey, this, sibling team, I noticed that you're 80% new features. You're only spending 20%. That seems kind of low. You own a lot of services. Is that good? Is that okay? Does that mean you're accruing a lot of technical debt? And that would bring this conversation where they would say, yes, in fact, we are. We're racing towards a launch. But that means after the launch, we're going to have to come back and pay some tech debt. And that at that time to me is that's like a very, very mature team where not only they're asking themselves this question, they're asking these questions about, is this the right metric? Why is it going up? Why is it going down? Do you need another metric? Are you sure you should be measuring this of each other? So it's a very organic, but I would say it's taken us about 4 years to get there. So not an easy journey.
But you are there, so that's good because it's, if the whole company culture is supporting this and everyone on the inside is focused on the actual impact of their work, I think you've achieved quite a lot with it.
Yeah. I would say it has been good. Getting there sometimes, again, in retrospective, maybe I'd be interested to learn from other leaders in terms of what they have done. We had to almost demonstrate the value to these teams by basically forcing them to use metrics. Once they got the value, then we no longer had to force it because they saw the value. It was one of those where it's like, how do you get there? It's like a chicken and egg problem, right? If they haven't seen the value, they won't take it up, right? So anyway, it's a bit of a change management paradox that I'm still grappling with.
Yeah. And now using AI and implementing AI to increase developer efficiency, you already have set the ground with the metrics to understand, whether what you're doing is actually making an impact. How are you using data to see if AI is making a difference?
Yeah, this is actually one, I would say, place where we got very lucky. So we started on this journey 4 years ago, and the latest AI sort of breakthroughs came maybe about 2 years ago or so with the GPT-4. And ever since, basically, almost every engineering leader is asking themselves, or is being asked, how is AI impacting your organization? What if you had this tool and that tool? Are you becoming more efficient, et cetera? Now, if an organization doesn't have any of these metrics in place in terms of product metrics, workload metrics, engagement, velocity, et cetera, they're sort of a few quarters behind. Now what they have to do is they put those in place and then see how AI impacts it. So for us, we've been a little bit lucky by being ahead of that. What we're learning now is we're sort of maybe going back to the initial premise that a high performing team is one that is learning. And that by itself that's sort of like the input metric, the output metric will be better productivity and so on. So we look at this as more of there's a leading indicator of AI, and then there's a lagging or output indicator. And so currently we're focused on leading indicators, which is in a way adoption of AI tools by engineers. We are not saying, okay, because you adopted it, we must see some productivity gain. Because in fact, what we're seeing is for some engineers to change their tools, change the way they develop, there's actually initially a productivity loss because they have to do things maybe differently. Maybe their IDE was set up, they've been doing it the same way for 10 years. They got all the hotkeys, and all of a sudden, their whole workflow is changing. They're now using either different IDE, or they're now sort of asking Claude Code, and it comes back, and you're sort of tabbing your way. It's like, oh, I gotta learn it. I gotta relearn a whole bunch of things. So initially, we don't even expect the productivity. We think our hypothesis is that long term that'll be there, but initially we're focusing on adoption, which is how many engineers use these AI tools daily. If they use that, that should give us, if they're not being forced and they say, yep, I want to keep using these AI tools, that is a good leading indicator that the productivity will eventually essentially get there. That's not to say we haven't seen impact, but it's sort of, that's where it's a little bit dependent on the context. Some of the teams that are working on more greenfield, of course, they are seeing their cycle times improve because some of the prototypes they can build, they can do so much quicker with it. Some of the other teams working in large monolithic databases, maybe it's messier, lots of legacy code. Maybe they're not seeing as much of an impact. So there we are seeing, but it's not a uniform thing. But again, we're approaching it with leading indicators adoption, lagging indicator will be.
I love it. I love how that learning is part of everything that you do and you measure because it affects the performance long term.
One thing that we're sort of experimenting with AI is we have a few teams where the teams are in a way at the forefront of experimentation. So we're telling them to basically go and experiment with some of the tools, even if it's not going to work, if that makes sense. Like, it takes some big risks. And so one of the questions they've asked us is, look, if we do this, probably our productivity will get a hit. But what is our measure of success? And what we've basically given them as measure of success is the number of learnings, the size of the learning, and how much you share. So if you do that, if week after week you're sharing, I did this, I used, Replit, I used V0, et cetera, and it helped or it didn't, I used Claude Code this way. That is the measure of success. It's the learning pace. We're not looking necessarily right now for productivity gain. Once we learn, then yes, we will sort of converge. So yeah, learning is probably one of the key metrics we've got.
That's amazing. And then regarding other departments, so as a company, you're focused on integrating AI, automation, helping other companies to become more successful and more efficient. And because you do that for others, you also need to do it internally, right? With all of the other departments that are not engineering. How are you moving this forward? How are you using engineering to support other departments and incorporating AI within these other departments?
Yeah, really good question. One of the things, it's sort of you could say a strange judo move, and I'll explain what I mean by that is we are seeing opportunities where other departments out of engineering could potentially do some engineering work. So as an example, we have support teams, technical support teams that before were purely doing triage on bugs and issues. Now we're starting to see, okay, if engineering can provide you with some cursor rules, some Claude MD files, here are some test cases and so on, can they go a little bit beyond just triage and maybe put up a first MR and say, I think I used Claude Code and the guidance you gave me, and I think this might be the problem, right? Or maybe support calls an incident, and before it's like, okay, here's an incident, here's the customer impact. If we give them the right tools, can they start to say, well, you know what? I've got access to logs. I can ask, I've got an MCP with Sentry. I can get some of the alerts. I can maybe ask AI, where do you think the problem is? And so when the incident is called, I have a hypothesis using AI. So that's kind of like one, but then you can kind of start to extend that and say, okay, what would it take a product manager who says, you know what, or a designer, let's say, who keeps bringing up these little design problems and they just keep getting to the backlog because they're small. It's a little change. Folks are doing bigger features. What would it take for a designer to say, you know what if I could open the MR for this? I'm not 100% sure if this is right, but I want to open it. So this is where kind of like it's enabling others to do what maybe they couldn't do before. But here's the judo move. What's really interesting with this, what we're learning is in order for those departments to do this, engineering itself needs to get better. We need to do better documentation. We need to have better testing. We need to have better guidelines and, better deployment, better A/B testing, better flat, and so it's sort of like a weird situation where if we get better, we're allowing others, and AI is kind of the catalyst in doing that. So it's kind of an interesting journey where we think we're helping others, but they're actually helping us get better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wrapping things up, what's one thing that you want every engineer on your team to understand about how you work?
I think I would, again, go back to that initial premise of the velocity of learning. So velocity is both speed and iteration, but also the size of the learning. And that to me, in any profession, but I would maybe say in engineering is critical. And so whatever we've been doing, whatever has made us successful up until this point, both as a company or as an individual or as a team, needs to evolve to the next thing, and whatever the next thing is. And that means a mechanism to learn, which also means making mistakes and failures and so on. But there's this ever evolving demand to find better ways and better things. And to me, that's like intrinsic to engineering, because engineers almost like intrinsically want to make things better. Can a car go faster? Can we fly higher? Can we lift bigger things, right? We're always doing this, but kind of reflecting that back onto ourselves. Can our teams be better? Can our organization be better? Can a process be better? And always be learning is the one thing I go by.
I love it. Any final advice for other engineering leaders listening?
It's not advice, it's more of a plea to share out. We're all, in the age of AI, we're all experimenting, we're learning. I would love for as many people to share out what they're seeing so that we don't invent the wheel multiple times in organizations. So this is something that I would love to hear from other leaders. What are they doing? How are they experimenting? What are they finding? What mistakes are they making so that they save me from making that mistake? And I'm more than happy to share the mistakes I'm making so that others don't have to make that.
Perfect. CTO Insights is brought to you by Adiva. To learn more about how we support innovative tech teams, visit adiva.it. Don't forget to subscribe to CTO Insights on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Substack, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.